Hey, this is Matt from the Woodworking Nook. Today we're going to build a very simple coffee table. Stay tuned. Coffee tables are a great project for when you're first starting out woodworking. They're pretty simple and easy to do, and you can kind of make them as simple as you'd like. This one today, we're going to make it out of 3/4 inch maple plywood, edge band the sides, and add veneer to the top. So a pretty simple process. Right here we're just cutting it down to size. And make sure to include the thickness of the edge banding that you will be using. As you can see here, I needed to cut a little extra off to account for that edge banding. The edge banding that I will be using is a 1x2 piece of walnut from the hardware store. So I'm just cutting this down to size, and I will be ripping them in half to put on all four sides of the coffee table. The reason I'm doing it so thick is to account for those rounded corners. I wanted all hardwood edge banding around the coffee table. So to account for those corners, I needed to beef up those sides a little bit more. So just using this painter's tape method with the combination square to make sure all my cuts are aligned properly. Because the bottom of the coffee table will pretty much always be hidden, I'm just going to add some dark stain to the bottom so that when someone drops something underneath the coffee table, it won't totally stand out to them. So just applying this stain here and wiping off the excess after. Once that was done, I needed to add the edge banding onto the sides of the piece of plywood. Because of the thickness of the edge banding, I wanted to use a biscuit joiner to make sure they were aligned properly. If you're using a thinner piece of edge banding, you can probably just use clamps and glue to make sure it's aligned properly. If you do use a biscuit joiner, you just want to make sure your reference edge is the same for the plywood and the edge banding. So in my case, I'm referencing that top fence of the biscuit joiner when cutting out each slot. And if you like these kinds of builds and more, please hit that subscribe button. It helps me out a lot. After the biscuits were cut, it was time to glue the edge banding onto the coffee table. If you do end up using biscuits, I would highly recommend using clamps for this. My clamps were currently being borrowed, so I was not able to clamp this down. I just used the painter's tape method and tried to get it as tight as I could. You could also use the iron-on edge banding for this project as well. I just find the hardwood tends to last longer. And I let this glue dry overnight, and in the morning removed all the painter's tape. And the next step was to flush trim all the edges. So I got this really basic flush trim router jig out. It's just a piece of wood that attaches to my router and allows me to get close to the edge and trim it flush with a mortise bit. So you want to set it so that it's just barely above that plywood, but allows you to cut into the edging that sticks up. So you can kind of see here how that trims it off. For the last little edge that still sticks up, you'll just take a sander to make sure it's sanded completely flush. Since we're putting veneer on this, the whole surface needs to be completely flat without any voids. Now I'm going to be adding the rounded corners, just using something that's circular to round off those corners, and using my track saw to cut off the majority of that rounded corner. This is where you can see that excess hardwood edge banding is needed to make that rounded corner. Then I take my belt sander to fully shape that rounded corner. And this actually worked a lot better than I was anticipating. I was originally going to use a router with a flush trim bit and a template, but I couldn't get access to a template in time. So then I just took my orbital sander to kind of make those final touches to those rounded corners. After this was done, it was time to prep for the veneer. I got this piece of veneer from GL Veneer. I can add a link in the description to their website. You can use a razor blade, or I just use really sharp scissors in this case, since it's along the grain to cut it to size. And you want to make sure that you have at least 1/4 inch on every side of the veneer. I now apply a water-based contact cement to both surfaces. This water-based contact cement is way better on the brain cells than the solvent-based one. And I'll add a link in the description to this water-based contact cement. After it was dry, it was time to apply it to the coffee table. I'm adding spacers so that I can align the veneer before we stick it down to the coffee table. And if you notice, I set those spacers against the grain of the veneer, so I had to flip those around so that I could slowly push down the veneer. I'm just first pushing it down with my hand to try to get all those air bubbles out, then using a piece of hardwood with a sanded edge to apply pressure to the veneer. You want to make sure you hit those edges as well on the coffee table. So now we're going to use a flush trim bit to trim off the excess veneer around the coffee table. Doing 2 passes of the flush trim bit helps to knock off all of the glue bits that kind of come off during that first pass. After the flush trim bit, we use a round over bit to round over the veneer on the edges so that nothing can catch that veneer and try to rip it up. It's adhered very well to the coffee table, but when you add that round over, it makes it extremely difficult to even catch an edge to pull it up, which makes it a pretty durable coffee table. So now we're just going to do a final sand to the coffee table. And before we add the finish to the top, I'm going to add these metal table legs, which I highly recommend getting if you're first starting out woodworking, because I've had these for almost 8 years now and have been used on many different coffee tables that I've made. I'm now going to be using Rustic Lumber's furniture oil to finish the top. I've used them on my nightstands and my headboard, and they make a very good product that's also budget friendly. I have a link to them in the description below. I use a Scotch-Brite pad to apply the finish to the top and to the edges. Keep in mind the edges will soak up a lot more finish than the top, since the top is veneered and the sides are hardwood. So after 15 minutes, remove that finish and did a quick sand a day later. But that finished up the coffee table. And I think it turned out pretty good. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you on the next one.